Hello everyone and welcome to the story of Saltwell Park. My name's Anthea Lang. I'm a local history author and tour guide, and Saltwell Park is one of my favourite places to visit. The story of the park actually starts with this gentleman, William Wales, who was a noted stained glass manufacturer, and in 1853 bought what was referred to as the Saltwell Cottage estate. And this is a plan of what the estate looked like when Wales bought it. I've marked with a green star today's main park entrance, but the lilac star shows the entrance to William Wales's estate, and you would come through the gates there and straight into the Dean, and that was a real feature of the landscape as far as Wales was concerned. He would go on to just rent out those 4 fields that you can see, but the area to the right of the Dean, that was the area that he landscaped, and that was the area that he would go on to build his house. And this is the house. It's rather remarkable for various reasons. It was certainly completed by 1871, but unusually those walls that you can see, they'd been built by the 1860s certainly. Usually you'd build a house and then build walls to go around it, but Wales often did things in a contrary fashion. And you might notice that the sort of castellated sort of little lookout points there on the walls, they're octagonal in shape, and that became a feature of many of the buildings and structures in the park. And this is why the estate gets its name. The original Saltwell, it wouldn't at all look like this, but this was how Wales reconstructed it, if you like. And you can see his initials on the top there and the date 1872. There's a horse trough, and then underneath the horse trough is a little area for the good of thirsty dogs, which is a nice little touch. And of course, when this was constructed, it would have a much more open aspect than it does today, because the Saltwell Lane ran right along, and then there was an open aspect. But of course, today we've got Saltwell Road South built at a higher level, which means that there's a wall now facing the well. And this was the Dean. This postcard was produced after the park was in evidence. So it's slightly neater than it would have been when Wales had it. Wales wanted to keep it as a very sort of Scottish, romantic landscape. And of course, you just have to think of somewhere like Cragside and realise how much landowners wanted to create areas like this for themselves. And then the final sort of tour de force that Wales produced was this, the maze. He was quite a family man and often would have young relatives staying at the at Saltwell Towers, and probably created this in an effort to get them out from under his feet. You know, go and get lost. Brings a whole new meaning to that phrase. So they were all the things that were in evidence when Gateshead Council began to look for an area on which to construct a park. Obviously, the 19th century was a century full of poverty, poor living conditions and sanitary conditions, and it was seen nationally that public areas such as parks were a good remedy for poor health. And it got people away from industrial areas, it got people away from the local hostelries, if you like. And of course, parks were free to enter, which was a great attraction for the poor. So the council had looked at an area at Shipcote owned by Lord Northbourne, but then after that fell through, Wales got wind of what the council wanted to do and proposed selling them various areas of his estate. At first it was just the fields, and then it was the fields and the gardens, and then it was the fields, the gardens and the house, and eventually it was the whole lot. Wales was allowed to live in the house for the remainder of his lifetime for £120 rent a year, which was quite a good deal, really. He probably sold it. People like to suggest that he was on hard times. Well, he wasn't on hard times. I think it was just easier to think about leaving money in a will rather than leaving a large estate. And this was a large estate, it was 56 acres. So the council applied for £35,000 of government funding to build the park, of which 32,000 went in various instalments to Wales. He didn't get all the money straight at once. So £3,000 for landscaping, but in actual fact, the landscaping came to a lot more than that. Edward Kemp, who had previously done work on the estate for Wales privately, was appointed as the architect, the landscape architect for the park. And he came with a huge raft of experience. He'd been park superintendent at Birkenhead Park. He had written books about garden design. And he estimated that the total costs for landscaping and things like railings, but not buildings, would come to about £11,000. And so on the Whit weekend, 1876, we don't even know exactly which day it was, Saltwell Park was open to the public. These are the main gates, and this is the council emblem, the goat's head. And Gateshead Park, not Saltwell Park, Gateshead Park, opened 1876. And this was the park superintendent's house. The park superintendent was George Lindsay, who was actually Wales's gardener, and he got the job. This was originally a single-storey house, and you can see where that would have gone to. But in 1893, it was extended, and an additional storey was added onto the building. But this was Kemp's main entrance, and this was certainly designed to make a statement. Kemp knew that there would be a lot of new housing built around the park, and this was one reason to put the gates at the junction of Avenue Road and East Park Road and Saltwell View. The other was that it's on an incline, so of course you came through those gates for the first time, not knowing what you'd expect, and immediately you were confronted by flowers, trees, and the hills, which all belonged to Lord Ravensworth, but the impression was that everything that you could see belonged to the park. What you didn't see when you first went in the early days was the lake, because that lake it wasn't added until quite a few years after the park was opened. And this is the first structure that was formally unveiled. This is the George Charlton Memorial Fountain, unveiled on the 5th of September, 1876. George Charlton had been Mayor of Gateshead when the plans were going through for the idea of having a public park here. And he was a great temperance man, so a water fountain was a very appropriate memorial. The only trouble was that the water supply in the park was rubbish. And it wasn't very long before this fountain was being rationed for use. It's never been a great success, and obviously it's not a fountain today. But this was one of Kemp's design features, and it says something about Kemp that his basic landscape is still what we use today, and the fact that it's used by hundreds of thousands of people each year is a testament to how good his plans were. Here's something else that he designed, the Broad Walk, or the Long Walk it's referred to here. And this was the area for promenading. And on the bench at the front of the photograph, you can see Mr. Wilson, who was the head gardener, sitting in the centre, and his daughter Alice Smith in the white blouse. And here you would come on a Sunday afternoon, young men, young women in their finery, and it wasn't very long before extra police were being drafted into the park to deal with the lewd language used by some of the young men against some of the young ladies. And you can also see the building the refreshment pavilion, which was part of Kemp's plan, and you'll see that again shortly, subtly altered with a new name. Now, this was the Octagonal bowling green, which was created by Kemp. Unusual shape. The turf was brought in from Sheriff Hill Fever Hospital, And in the background, you can see one of the original aviaries. Animals and birds weren't meant to be a feature of the park, but Gateshead had a very enthusiastic police superintendent who was very keen on adding animals and birds to the park. Some were much more successful than others. The stag, which was donated by Lord Ravensworth, was not a success because it gored a visitor, and Gateshead Council had to pay a substantial amount of compensation. And Mr. Elliot, the Chief Constable's monkeys, also didn't go down too well because monkeys have no sense of decorum. And eventually they were banished to an island in the lake. And this was another picture of the Dean. Kemp had to widen the paths and curb the paths to make them safe, but otherwise didn't do very much to Wales's designs other than adding bridges across. Now, someone else who did a lot of work on the park was the Borough Surveyor for Gateshead Council, a gentleman called James Bower. And James Bower designed 2 shelters at either end of the Broadwalk, modelled on buildings in Chelsea, which he would have known because that was the area that he lived in as a young man. And these were designed for shelter, which is probably quite a good idea. Octagonal in shape to go with the turrets on the walls. Now this is the Broadwalk again, with 2 subtle additions and other things in this photograph which are quite interesting. The refreshment pavilion now has a clock added to it, and the clock was added by Mr. Armand, who was a wallpaper manufacturer, and the refreshment pavilion became known as the Armand Pavilion as a result, and that was added in 1903. Also added in 1903 was the statue that you can see of Alderman John Lucas, who was a very popular councillor and mayor of Gateshead. The other interesting things in the photograph are the 2 prams, or perambulators as they were called, because they were actually banned under the regulations when the park was first opened. There were no wheeled vehicles allowed in the park at all, but people soon complained that prams, it was ridiculous. People couldn't bring young children because prams were banned. So prams regulations were relaxed, and prams were able to be wheeled into the park, but bicycles weren't allowed into the park until 1893, and then weren't allowed to be ridden in the park. Now this is the East Lodge. Kemp had thought about lodges, but they weren't original. There are 2 lodges and they were added at different times. This one was added in 1881. The first tenant after Wales died was a chap called Hugh Clayton Armstrong. And Clayton Armstrong wanted a house for his butler, and so asked the council to build this house, and they did. It's in the same kind of brickwork as the towers, and it's a very attractive building. And of course there are gates here, which was an important part of going into a park. It was always a good idea to have a lodge beside an entrance gate, because then people knew that they were being monitored, that they couldn't misbehave. This is the West Lodge, or as it was termed originally, the Dean Lodge. This was built in 1886 at what was effectively Wales's original entrance to the park, so just at the entrance to the Dean. And this was the home of the park's resident policeman for many years. And here you can see the lake. This was added in 1880 at a cost of £542, 3 shillings and 3pence. And it was largely designed by James Bower. The planting was designed by John Hancock. And William Wales himself had designed a rockery on the island in the lake. And what you can see in the photograph is the bandstand, and you've got a good view of the Almond Pavilion. Now the bandstand's interesting because this was actually the second bandstand, the first bandstand rotted very quickly, and the first bandstand had been much nearer the towers. This bandstand was in the area between the Broadwalk and the lake, and you can also see the rowing boats. And round the bandstand, you can note an area of concrete, and this was to stop people walking around the bandstand on the grass. The council got very annoyed about people doing that and wearing the grass away. And you'll see shortly the final remedy that they took to stop people walking around the bandstand. This was the most exotic building in the park. This was the Indo-Chinese Pavilion. And this had come from the 1887 exhibition to celebrate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee on Exhibition Park in Newcastle. It was used by Lyons Tea Company as a cafe, and it was the forerunner, if you like, of the Lyons Corner Houses. And this was used as a refreshment pavilion as well, to supplement the Almond Pavilion. It cost £50, but unfortunately it was never a success. It was the home to rats, and the people who tenanted the Almond Pavilion complained that they couldn't keep stores here. So eventually it was just used to store the boats from the lake over the winter. It cost the council £50. It was only designed to be a very temporary building, but it actually lasted until 1958, when it was finally demolished. And you can see it here as a background to the third bowling green, which was opened in 1901 at a cost of £385. Now, this photograph is amazing. It was taken on the 22nd of June 1897 to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and there were 42,000 people in the park that day, of whom 12,000 were children. They'd all had to march to the park from their schools. They were all armed with a paper bag containing an orange and 2 buns, and they got a commemorative medal for being in the park that day. In 1905, this was added. This is the statue to commemorate the 77 Gateshead men who died in the Boer War, and it's always referred to as the Angel of Peace. It was unveiled on the 11th of November 1905, a day which we would commemorate today as Armistice Day, but the 11th of November in 1905 had absolutely no significance whatsoever, so it's a rather interesting coincidence, that date. 900 men from Gateshead actually went to fight in the Boer War. Now here's the lake again, and the little building which was the boat attendant's house, which cost £10, and that also came from Exhibition Park in 1887. And you can see the council's solution to people walking around the bandstand in the background, because what they decided to do in 1909 was to put the bandstand on the island in the lake, which meant that all the bandsmen had to be rolled out before they could perform. And the other big problem was that if the wind was in the direction, it didn't matter how hard they blew their instruments, nobody could hear a thing. And here's another view. You can see the railings that they erected, and they inserted a timber structure within those so that at least they weren't playing in a wind tunnel. In 1916, Saltwell Towers was used as a VAD hospital, Voluntary Aid Detachment Hospital, under the auspices of the St John's Ambulance Brigade and the Red Cross. It was an offshoot of a similar hospital at Winnie House. And here you can see the men in their hospital blues. Many of these men would have suffered from being gassed. In 1920, we got new swings, and these were, as you can see, very popular with children. The only problem was, don't try and do anything on swings or anything else on a Sunday, because they were all covered up. And that situation remained until well into the 20th century. There were also 2 seesaws added shortly after these swings were erected. And in 1921, the council bought a new area, the Grove, to add to the park. And this is Grove House, but this wasn't included in the sale. And you do wonder how many balls went over that flimsy fence before it had better fencing. The council were going to charge admittance to the Grove, but they never actually did. But what they did was to move the bandstand from the island into the Grove on a proper platform, so that was much better. The Grove is actually 5 acres in size. It cost the council £4,000, and it was bought from the estate of Elisha Hunter Riot, who had occupied Grove House. And then this is the slide, constructed of birch wood and steel. And generations of children played on that slide. It was erected in 1931 and it cost £35. Now the towers, which had been tenanted until the First World War when it was used as a hospital, and then briefly tenanted again, had been unused and unloved really for about 14 years. As a result of which it wasn't in very good condition. There was quite an amount of dry rot. But the council decided to convert it into a local and industrial museum. And it opened on the 8th of July 1933. It used 6 rooms out of the 20 rooms that were in the building. And the first curator was a chap called Frank Young, and he was allowed to live in the towers. He had his quarters there. And it remained until 1969, when eventually dry rot did for it. The floor fell in and it had to be hastily closed, and it was then abandoned until the restoration a few years later, which I'll tell you about in a little while. This was one of the things that was inside. It was an ancient shop front which had come from the High Street. Grahamsley Street was just off the High Street. Williams General Dealer. Now this is the Rose Garden. This was originally William Wales's kitchen garden. And this is an interesting addition to the park. Angus McBean, who was the park superintendent, devised a plan to use unemployed labour. There were national schemes. Councils could come up with ideas to use unemployed men for various improvements. And McBean came up with the idea of creating a rose garden in the park. So no park gardeners were actually involved in the creation of this. It was all unemployed men. They planted 3,500 rose bushes, and it was really lovely. It's still a rose garden today, but it must have been magnificent when it first opened. During the Second World War, the park was used for holidays at home because people were obviously discouraged from travelling anywhere for holidays. And so games, competitions, dances were all held in the park, 1 week in June and 1 week in August. There was a colour film. This photograph is taken from that film, which was made by one of Gateshead's policemen. And this was when the air raid shelter was being created. The air raid shelter could house 648 people. So it was the largest public shelter that you could get. And it was designed for the park because many of the houses, although some of them were substantial houses, they didn't have a lot of land or gardens on which to erect Anderson shelters. Ironically, the only stick of bombs that fell anywhere in Gateshead was actually in Saltwell Park, which blew out the windows of many of those houses that you can see in the background, and also blew out part of the windows and affected the door of the little theatre. Now, this aeroplane appeared in the park in 1982, and it was still here Stayed for 11 years. Saltwell Airways, it was christened. It was actually 2 aeroplanes. It was a bit of a composition, but many children remember playing on this aeroplane. It had formerly been in Lambton Lion Park, and then when that closed, it was transferred to Saltwell. Kemp couldn't possibly have dreamed that one up. Now, between 1999 and 2005, the park underwent a major restoration, which cost £9.6 million. Part of the money came from the Heritage Lottery Fund, part of the money came from Gateshead Council. And as a result of that, the lake was dredged and improved. There was new planting, many trees were cut back. The paths were renewed, new bridges were constructed across the Dean. But the big thing, the thing that cost most of the money, was the restoration of Saltwell Towers. And we are very lucky to still have Saltwell Towers in the park, because this was a building that was built with no foundations, and the brickwork was completely rotten. In the 70s, the council had taken the roof off. The whole place was just riddled with damp and dry rot. Fireplaces, which had been lovely plastered, beautiful ceilings, were all destroyed. The whole building had to be literally rebuilt, built brick by brick. And if you ever complain that this area is incongruous with the wood and the glass, well, part of the reason was that some of the bricks were in such bad condition that they couldn't be reused. And also, permission wasn't granted by historic organisations to recreate the towers as either a home or as a museum. It had to have a new use, and the new use was to create a cafe on the ground floor and an exhibition area on the first floor. But we are just so lucky to still have that building. It was nearly demolished on more than one occasion. This is one of the bridges in the Dean. All these had to be renewed. Some of the original bridges had been quite flimsy, and the Dean had become a totally overgrown area and a no-go area, really. It wasn't considered a safe area to go to. And the maze was replanted, and all these metal barriers were installed, because children used to just run through and destroy the planting, over years. So these small trees were planted, which are now quite big, and you can't actually see the metal at all. The Saltwell was also restored. The black and the red are very Victorian colours. And in 2006, we had a sculpture trail in the park, and many of the sculptures are still in existence. This is one. This is called Juxtaposition, by a Japanese artist called Hideo Furuta, who is a physicist and a mathematician. This was Gateshead Council's last entry to the Chelsea Flower Show, and it got a bronze medal. And it depicts the Tyne Bridge, and every plant depicts a runner in the Great North Run. In 2011, we got the Japanese garden, created by people from Komatsu, which is a town in Japan, which is twinned with Gateshead. And this uses gravel to represent water, and it's a nice addition to the park. And so is this, which is the Garden of Reflection, added in 2015 to commemorate 2 soldiers, Mark Turner and Stephen Dunn, and other Gateshead men who have died in combat. And this also has attached, this is part of the garden, which is a very peaceful area of the park. And the latest addition is the Buzzing Garden. This has been produced in conjunction with horticulture students in Sweden, and it will be a haven for wildlife. It actually uses the former area of the Octagonal bowling green. So the park always changes, it never stays still for very long, and it's always a beautiful place to visit. And I would just like to end on this slide, which is not Saltwell Park, this is Beamish, but this is where you will find Gateshead's original bandstand, or its second bandstand anyway. This was removed from the park in the 70s and given on loan to Beamish Museum. Beamish Museum then loaned us what was Bishop Auckland's bandstand. So we've now got Bishop Auckland's bandstand, and Beamish have Saltwell Park's bandstand. So I say no more about that, but it's nice to see anyway. And that brings us to the end. So I hope you've enjoyed this little trip around the park. If you've never been to the park before, then please do pay it a visit, because it is a lovely place.